Introducing The Water Hour, the show that dives deep into the critical role of water in shaping the South African economy and society. It is often said that water is life, and yet our water systems are under severe strain. Today we're looking at water in three parts. There's the crisis in Johannesburg, how Cape Town's drought experience informs resilience, and of course the national picture, including policy, water partnerships office options, and also digital tools reshaping water trading, quality and scarcity. Stay with us. We will be right back. Welcome to The Water Hour, the show that dives deep into the critical role of water in shaping our society and economy. Don't miss out on our insights and updates on water-related issues. Join us as we explore the work of the South African Water Chamber, only on The Water Hour. If you're just joining us, then welcome to The Water Hour. I'm your host, Bridget Limbanda from Cape Town in South Africa, and our live stream today is brought to you by BeLive Media and the South African Water Chamber. Now, this is an audience-centric show, and we are monitoring the comments, so please feel free to comment or to post your questions to our panelists. In our panel today is Benoît Le Roy, founding member and CEO of the South African Water Chamber, with a long career in water, wastewater, and environmental engineering. And he's involved in reuse, water security, and project structuring in South Africa. And then from Australia, Dr. Anthony Turton, who is a seasoned water resources scientist and strategist, a transboundary water specialist and academic with a focus on water as a national security and governance issue. He has a very long publication record and advisory roles. So let's welcome them to the broadcast. Good morning, gentlemen. I trust you're all well.
Morning, Brigitte. Thanks for hosting us again. Greatly appreciated.
Good morning to you both. Good to be back on there.
Fantastic. Let's jump right in. South Africa is facing a water crisis that is as urgent as our energy crisis. Now, to help set the scene for the conversation, can I ask each of you to very briefly share what you see as the single biggest issue we're facing right now when it comes to water security? Benoît, can we start with you? And then Anthony, if you could give your comment after that, please.
Sure. Thanks, Brigitte, and to the viewers. There's a lot of moving parts that's actually happening, which we'll talk about, a bit later, which is really the good news. But I call this a convenient truth because we predicted this 23 years ago with the statement of free water, which started the collapse, with a few other things. But the biggest issues are dams inland are full. Vaal Dam last week was at 105%, integrated Vaal River system just below 100%, has been like that for a very long time. And there's many reasons for that. And we've got level 1 restrictions in Gauteng, in all three metros, and we have water shedding daily, nightly, specifically in Joburg, but to a certain extent, Tshwane Ekurhuleni is still okay from that perspective, apart from Bedford View. And we also have a bulk water provider who's 10 years behind their program. So if you add all this in here, we don't have water in our taps. Industry is busy moving out. And in the Western Cape, we've got the absolute reverse. The dams are at 91% at the moment, which is a little bit lower than last year, but it's good enough. It's good enough for the next 18 months. But we've got big business, technology, manufacturing, tourism, etc., all and head office moving down to the Garden Route and to the Western Cape, not only because of water security, but because basic services. But water is actually pivotal. But we'll touch on some really, really good developments in trying to enforce. The single root cause is a lack of accountability. And Department of Water Sanitation is only drive at the moment with COPTA and Treasury is to drive the accountability agenda. And I'm glad that this was launched 2 weeks ago. And it's unfortunately government, and I take them on in public very often, do not broadcast good news. So there's some really, really good news, but the water insecurity in Gauteng will be with us for 5 to 10 years. And it's starting to get worse, and it will get far worse. So that's the convenient truth. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And if I could move to you, Anthony, what would you say is the biggest issue that you think we're facing when it comes to water security?
Yes, okay. Over the last couple of months, I've been writing a book which is about to be published now. And in that book, I've done quite a deep dive into things that have been happening in the transition to our democracy. And one of the startling things that came out of my research there was the fact that the South African population over the last 4 decades has almost trebled. That's an important factor. The population growth has been quite significant. And there's no way that the infrastructure in our major metros have kept abreast. There's no way that our national infrastructure has kept abreast. So that's been happening. Population growth has been quite staggering, quite large. But the second thing that's happened is what Benoît has just done now. There's been a migration within the country from urban areas from rural areas to urban areas, and from places under pressure such as Johannesburg, Gauteng, to the Western Cape. So these internal movement of people, that's the one factor, but the population growth that has not been kept pace with the infrastructure development, in my mind, that is probably one of the biggest drivers. Because what that tells us is that unless we have at least doubled or maybe trebled the capacity of the supply systems, we are always going to be very, very far behind and playing catch up.
Thanks very much for setting the stage for our conversation there. So, Benoît, I'm going to start off with some questions for you. How fragile is our current water infrastructure, and what risks does this pose for ordinary South Africans?
So on the resource side, we've built over the last 30 to 40 years roughly a tenth, so 1 order of magnitude less of dam storage capacity. So I know government's been saying we built more dams, but the volume is negligible. That's the first thing. So our dams really, the last really big one was Henry Verwoerd, now Gariep, and that was in the 1960s. I was a child and we used to fly there every 3 months to visit our French expat friends. And so we haven't built any infrastructure to harness more resource. And it doesn't mean that we have much more resource in South Africa. We've got the Zimvubu scheme, for example, in KZN, which is also 10, 15 years late, but that's minor alleviation. We have a scheme in Lesotho, which is not South Africa, but it's the headwaters of the Senku Basin. And Botswana has now signed a deal to, in actual fact, get part of that water. And Namibia is squealing that they're not getting enough. So the reality is that the surface waters, taking climate change vagaries out of the equation, there isn't really much more we can capture. But the population hasn't stopped, the urbanization hasn't stopped. So we need to find new sources and we need to reduce our footprint. And the biggest user of water at the moment, inefficient user, are the metros outside of the Western Cape. So they roughly just below 50% of the water is unaccounted for, termed as non-revenue water, and the big portion of it is not theft. The big portion are physical leaks. So the resource side, we need to find new sources, and on the coast we've got plenty seawater, and that level of that reservoir is rising. Desalination has become a lot more affordable, but what's the price you're prepared to pay when there's no water? So the price is actually not an issue. Australia's embarking on over 12 new desalination plants on the coast for the same reasons, because of demand growth. So we've got plenty of water there. We need to start. We do reuse at a macro scale most of our water, but what we need to do is reduce the amount of water we use for agriculture, for industry. And the cities have to pinch, and it's a national priority, have to pinch their physical leaks. So roughly the urban environment uses about 30% of the water in South Africa, and half of it is unaccounted for. So that's 50% of the water reserve just gone. So that will fill the gap that we have, not that we will have, that we have. The 2030 thing is a panacea. We have a deficit as we speak right now. The water is fully allocated, and we have an unusual situation where the integrated river system is very full. But the biggest national priority is to reduce the non-revenue water to 15%, and to 25%. It's a very, very lax target, but it's a difficult one because it's going to require 200 to 400 billion rand, and the physical leaks component to 15%. So it's basically reducing things by 50%. We have not started outside the Western Cape. And so we've got to start with that, and we can't start with that if we do not have security of funding, and also if we do not have governance at a level that is really acceptable to the overflow of money in South Africa and globally for water-related projects. So funding is not actually the problem. So our biggest problem that's visible at the moment is not food security, but that's coming. And it's not just a water quantity, it's a water quality issue. Our biggest issue is in the towns, the taps are running dry. So the small towns that ran dry years ago, and hence, as Tony says, a lot of urbanization, but the taps are dry in Gauteng continuously, and we have water shedding, which we predicted about 7-8 years ago already, and we were attacked for using the word of the impending water shedding, but we have it. And whether we like it or not, it's going to get worse, purely because the system is now being subjected to a more equitable distribution of water, resulting in all the systems running dry at some stage within the week, because it's rotational water shedding. So we are destroying the system, but there's nothing else we can do apart from replacing the system or upgrading the system. So the supply side, the supply side is not the immediate issue. It will become an issue, but it's really the distribution side is a huge issue. And what we're seeing is with climate change is it's just making things, so we call it stochastics, unpredictable. Things are becoming quite difficult, because last year in Gauteng inland, we got 6 months with the rain in 3 months, because it started after Christmas instead of October. So you're unable to capture as much water, but also you get a lot of damage, etc. We're seeing it in Europe, for example. We're seeing it in the Far East. So now what we've got to do is realize that the dam capacities are not going to be adequate, and in actual fact may not be in the right areas because of the rainfall patterns, changing. So the average citizen, it's not just in South Africa, worldwide, doesn't care about water until the taps run dry. So we're very reactive, and we have a reactive government. So now we sit with a problem that is going to take 2 decades, 1.5 to 2 decades, to sort out completely when we start, and we haven't started. So the biggest issue is, in actual fact, is how do we kickstart it? So things are starting to try the kickstart, but we haven't kickstarted.
So from just to break it down a little bit, from a systems perspective, where are the critical choke points? Is it dams? Is it bulk infrastructure? Is it distribution at municipal level? Where is the biggest hurdle?
It's the distribution at local government level, which has a blend of bulk, where they've got really big lines, 4-6 meter diameter pipelines. So it's from the reservoir, receiving treated water from the water board or the water service authority. From that reservoir, and we've seen Gauteng, the Rand water reservoirs, the Rand water is running above its abstraction limits, and it's pumping at 100%, and the reservoirs are 30 to 40%, irrespective of whether it's summer or winter, which means it's not the people who are demanding the water, it's the system. So if the reservoirs in Joburg, 2/3 are leaking, then you've got the valves that are leaking, you've got pumps that aren't working, and you've got pipes that are 50 to 75 years old, designed for 40 to 60 years. And you've got some that are 100 years old. So what's happening is those are leaking. So and these are in the suburbs, in the CBD, etc. So once they start leaking, the rate of leakage increases exponentially. It's not a linear thing. So what happens? You chase your tail. You cannot catch up unless you replace large parts of the system. So Johannesburg has to replace about 13 to 15 billion rand of its bulk and distribution network to get down to about 15 to 20% physical leaks from its current 27, 28% physical leaks. There's a number of 35 users, not correct. We have the dashboards, which Tony can speak about, which give us the right numbers. So we do have the right data and the right numbers, but this is pipes that are under our gardens, our streets, our buildings, etc. This is complex work. So we have to not only replace, we have to increase the diameter of these pipes. We have to increase the reservoirs, as Tony said. They're not big enough. So we have about 9 to 12 hours of residence or storage capacity, and we're supposed to have 48 hours. So any minor hiccup that we have with the bulk supply around water, the system just goes dry. Boom, that's it. Plus with the increased population. So we've done nothing. And when I say nothing, we've done less than nothing in the last 30 years. So what's happened is the system is very vulnerable. Apart from being old, it just doesn't have enough volume in it. And that's why even when we fix all the leaks, etc., we will still run out because we've got to increase the volume. So not of Rand Water's reservoirs, we've got to increase the volume of the Metro's reservoirs in Gauteng. And that we've seen, there's big parties when we do one reservoir every 5 years in each Metro. We're supposed to be doing 5 to 10 a year in each Metro. So we have to increase that capacity by 200 to 300%. The quality, we're talking volume all the time, the quality of the water gets affected with all of these issues because we get ingress of sand and bacteria. So, you know, that's the next issue. And we saw what happened in Hammanskraal, you know, people died. So we obviously don't want that to happen in Joburg, but it's going to happen. There's no doubt about it that there's going to be health issues because the quality side is going to be affected by all of these physical collapses, you know, in the system. And quite honestly, if you look at the rates and taxes we pay in Gauteng, they're roughly around double those of Cape Town. And we don't have water security in Cape Town. We've got water security. We've got good quality water like up here, but we don't have the outages. We have some outages, but not the same outages. So where's the money going to, you know? And that's part of the root cause is that the money is not ring-fenced. It will be ring-fenced, but it's not ring-fenced. So the money, 4 million got swiped out. They say swiped, stolen out of Joburg Water's account to go and support other collapsing services in Johannesburg. And you want Joburg Water to perform. It can't. There's no money. Can't pay contracts. All the contracts are stopped.
Yeah. So my final question for you on water security, Benoît, before we switch over to Anthony, is what role can the private sector play in ensuring reliable water supply when the public systems are failing?
Sorry, what role can the?
What role can the private sector play to ensure
yes.
water supply?
So the private sector is, you know, and understanding humans get angry when the taps run dry. So the active citizenry from that perspective is very vocal, but unfortunately, stating the obvious and marching in streets and stating the obvious and getting shot at is not going to sort anything out. It does mobilize the PR machine and awareness and things like that, but we've seen it actually doesn't work. It just people, same as Eskom, Joburg Water, just don't go to these areas anymore because there's not enough police and the army hasn't been mobilized to protect them. So unfortunately, the active citizenry has to be channeled in such a way that it becomes effective. So that's a very difficult thing to do. The private sector big business has not acknowledged the water problem. It's not there yet. It's been energy security, and potholes, okay, but the water's still not on the agenda. It's sort of mentioned in the fine print in italics. So big business is still in denial. So what we busy doing is through various initiatives outside of the traditional business, big business is and using the big banks, for example, is getting government and business leaders to talk. And that's been happening now. It's been happening quite progressively so that business has to intervene and has to be not with money, with resources, as it's done in Eskom, has to intervene with resources and skills, but also it has to say that we will close shop and move out and also go down to another province on the coast where there's better water security if you don't sort this and this out. So ultimatums have been put onto the table. So that will start yielding results. The public at large, I think it's it's a matter of awareness of trying not to waste water, but when you don't have any, you can't waste it either. So, the consumer is not really the issue, but from an awareness perspective, we need to try and get the right story to the public. And we saw this failed in Nelson Mandela Bay, and the non-revenue water went from 30% to over 50% now. So during the drought, people in actual fact started using more water because of the wastage within the municipality. We don't want that to happen here, because that will create anarchy. So big business has started to panic, especially for example, on the food processing side, because they've got backup energy, but now they don't have water, and they're worried about continuous shutdowns, etc. And the healthcare system is also shut down continuously without water, especially the public side of it that seems to be more affected. So the issue of public-private sector participation, collaboration is not a dream anymore. It's actually happening. It's happening in pockets. And in actual fact, at the last function I was at 2 weeks ago, national government, so all the relevant ministries are all committed vocally and in public in cooperating and getting as much private sector support and collaboration that they can have. And in actual fact, the plea was made by the highest authority: please put us under pressure and hold us accountable. So yes, talk shops, but we're trying to convert those to workshops. So I haven't heard this language in 30 years. So to me, that's actually a good step forward. But what we don't want in the media is or what we don't want happening that is reported in the media is when you run out of water, we're going to shoot you if you complain. That's got to stop. That's really not a good picture. We've got to work together. So there's a lot of hostility, but from a business perspective, we see there's a lot of collaboration that's starting to happen, which is a good sign, because we can only sort this out together.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for sharing your perspectives. If we can now move to you, Anthony. And so my first question for you is, how does South Africa's water crisis tie into national security in terms of food production, economic growth, and even regional stability?
Well, the national security implications of this are vast, and probably will take more than the time you can allocate to me on the show. So at headline level, national security is driven by stability or instability. And one of the major causes of instability in South Africa has always been unemployment and service delivery. So as service delivery breaks down, so social stability goes up. So social instability increases. So services break down, social instability rises. And that's the problem now. As we become more unstable, of course, you now start getting positive feedback loops. And those positive feedback loops start feeding into the labor market, for example. The labor market cannot employ the people that need to be employed. Companies are coming under more and more pressure. Because they're coming under pressure, they cannot create the number of jobs we need. I mentioned earlier on the population growth rate that we've had over the last 4 decades. That's going back to before our transition to democracy. We've been unable to create jobs. For example, we should have had around about 7% economic growth rate per annum, decade on decade, for the last 4 decades, if we were going to close that gap and create employment. We have not done that, and this now feeds into the growing national security dilemma. So national security dilemma, at the end of the day, if we peel away all of the different layers of this onion, we get to the core, and the core is about money. It's about the inability of the government to mobilize enough funding now to repair the infrastructure needed, to maintain the service delivery needed, to maintain the economy which is needed, to create jobs which is needed, to bring about national, let's call it well-being, happiness, or social stability. So we are seeing more and more of this. And in fact, I'm quite surprised now. The current circumstances in Johannesburg, in my view, seem to be getting more and more dire by the day. There's large sums of money that have just gone, either go missing because of some or other inability to account for money within the system, or there's just this reckless kind of changing of leadership and demands made for vast sums of money that gets thrown around as if money is the problem. The money is not the problem. It's not a shortage of money. It's not a shortage of water. It's a shortage of management skills. It's a shortage of, it's a failure of institutions. So that's where we are today. I'm afraid we're facing somewhat of a dire circumstance in Gauteng at the moment, well, in the whole country, but in Gauteng particularly. And I think that this national security aspect is going to increasingly start becoming relevant. And particularly now, I mentioned this book that I've just written. And, in this book, I've mapped out some of the emerging trends that are happening globally. And one of those emerging trends is the emergence of so-called mafia states. And South Africa, unfortunately, is increasingly one of those where you see the emergence of mafias that control things like the water sector. And in South Africa, we've got a number of water mafias. I was an expert witness in some litigation recently that was about sewage mafias. So the sewage mafias that disrupt the flow of sewage, and they then basically demand sums of money, vast sums of money, to make the problem go away. So it's a classic sort of almost Brooklyn kind of New York kind of hustle, and that's what controls South Africa. And it's going to be exceedingly difficult to get rid of this because the money from taxpayers is being badly distributed. The little bit that's left is ending up in the hands of these mafias. And I'm afraid I hate to be a prophet of doom, but I'm afraid that all things being considered at the moment, anything short of a massive effort to turn this thing around, I'm afraid is going to end up in a failure.
Now, you've spoken a lot about water being a limiting factor in development. Can you expand just a little bit about what this means in practical terms for South Africa's future?
Well, yes, water is an indicator. If you just take, for example, World Bank kind of data that you get, or any internationally accepted metric of development or poverty, one of the key indicators is availability of water per capita, or the availability of sanitation services, etc. So water is, in fact, a defining variable. You can say that a community is poor by definition because they don't have access to clean and safe water. That's so that at the very foundation of any development strategy within a country has to be the provision of not only of water security, but also of water quality, which is part of water security. So the water quality aspect is very, very important, but the reliability of supply is also important. Now, this is breaking down, and it's breaking down at an accelerating rate, and it's breaking down in the metros, in the urban areas, but it's been breaking down in the smaller towns for a long time. Places like Harrismith and things like that. I was involved in a court case there a couple of years ago in Harrismith, where things are really got even worse subsequent to that. But those small towns don't generally end up in the national media, so people don't hear about them. But there's a lot of bad stuff happening in those small towns. But now the big metros are starting to come under the same sets of circumstances. So I believe it's only one potential spark away from a full-blown riot, and that's one of the reasons I've been criticized recently for some of my writing on the water boards, for example, because I am supportive of the water boards, even though they have got their problems and they are flawed. But the water boards are actually the thin blue line between South Africa and anarchy. So if the water boards fail, then South Africa is going to be unable to pull out of the nosedive. So the water boards are holding in some cases they have already failed. But those water boards that are holding, Bergwater in Cape Town is an example of a water board that's holding and doing a good job. Things like Bloemwater in the Free State have been under severe pressure. Mgani Water still holding its own. So these different water boards are in different states of repair or disrepair. So I am logically and knowingly pro water board because that is the right thing to do. Not because I'm trying to cover up mismanagement in those boards, but because without them, there is no alternative. And then we face absolute anarchy. So that's where we're going at the moment in this water security thing. There's this water as a national security risk has always been present in South Africa. I was involved during our transition to democracy in developing this concept within the security forces, within the intelligence service. I was the architect of that process within the what is then called the Secret Service and National Intelligence Agency. I was involved in developing that whole program, so I know a lot about how it was constructed and put together. But almost all of that has fallen away. It's no longer applicable under the current management and current leadership of the country. So I would argue that the country at the moment is unable to deal with water as a national security risk simply because they've lost the capacity that we started to develop immediately after our transition to democracy. But it takes a while to train people, to get people to understand what variables they must look at, what numbers they have to track down, what models they must use to make predictions, etc. And most of that, in terms of institutional memory, has unfortunately been lost by the intelligence services of South Africa. And that's just a great pity because at one stage we were world leaders in that space.
Thanks very much for that. And my final question on the segment for you, Anthony, is you've touched a little bit on it, but how do we balance urban water demand with rural and agricultural needs in essentially a water scarce country like South Africa?
Yes, this brings me to a piece that I wrote in Daily Maverick a while ago, for which I took some flack, and that piece is. I will just repeat that, and I would encourage people to go and read that piece again. Because what I spoke about there was the fact that I'm a member of the PWSG, the Platform for a Water Secure Gauteng. I try and be a responsible member of that platform, and the idea there is to help to understand how we need to cooperate in order to prevent a day zero in Gauteng. And the central messaging coming out of the PWSG is that we need to reduce consumption per capita. That's the single message coming out of it, reduce consumption per capita. Now, I'm supportive of that idea, and intellectually I understand it. But how can we do that where two bad things are happening? The one bad thing that's happening is that we've got 50% unaccounted for water. So in other words, we've got a huge amount of water that's just missing. So how do we now blame society for the missing water? Well, that simply means that your government increasingly loses legitimacy by bringing across that message. So that's clearly a problem. There are other aspects to that problem as well, but the important thing is that the messaging has to be that we must limit the supply or must reduce the supply or consumption per capita. But the second thing that we have not dealt with is the fact that the population growth and dynamics are changing in a fundamental way and an accelerating way. So more people are coming into the system, and we're not bringing the system in line with that. So in other words, the simple message of we need to reduce consumption, while it's necessary and logical if you just look at those narrow set of circumstances, it is the wrong message to put out when you start looking at the population growth. There you need to increase supply of water. So it's not just a water demand problem that we're facing. It's in fact also a water supply problem. And I mentioned in that piece, that the Daily Maverick piece that I wrote, about these different forces that work within this national security model. There's one is the centrifugal force. That's a force that breaks up, that forces things apart, and the centripetal force, a force that brings things together. So the centrifugal force is, well, in this case, very, very simple to understand. More water scarcity means less jobs available availability, more anger on the streets, therefore more potential rioting, and therefore that slow, steady decline into anarchy. So those are the centrifugal forces. The centripetal forces now are, well, we need to grow the economy. In order to grow the economy, we've got to restore investor confidence. Investors aren't our enemy. So what's going to bring the investors back into the space? Well, they need to know that there's an increase in supply of water, that there is, in fact, water available. Otherwise, they're not going to consider South Africa as a safe destination for investment. So the balancing of the centrifugal and the centripetal forces is very, very important. And that's what I've tried to convey in that piece. It's not a question of defending one or the other. We've actually got to have both of those messages. We have to increase supply. We have to increase the storage capacity. We have to improve the reticulation system at the same time as we have to also reduce consumption per capita. And getting that message out is a very, very difficult thing, through the popular media at the moment. And particularly, I'm finding that when societies become distressed, and I've referred to a distressed society as a broad society that's under all sorts of pressures, then in that distressed society, your messaging becomes even more difficult to do. And Benoît mentioned earlier on the corporate sector. My experience in South Africa is that the corporate sector, other than the banks, the banks, the Investex and the Nedbanks, they are light years ahead of the rest. But the rest of the corporate sector, and in particular the food production sector, are way, way, way behind the curve. In fact, they don't want to even talk about this stuff for reasons of their own that I cannot understand, and they are the ones that are going to be hit the hardest by it. So where the private sector comes into play, they tend to not be critical of government. They tend to not to want to ruffle feathers. So they tend to say, well, look, when the crisis comes, we'll deal with it then, So they keep kicking the can down the road, and that is not helpful as well. So in other words, the messaging of all of this is a really technically complex thing for communication specialists. And I don't see much effort being put into streamlining the messaging in South Africa at the moment.
Thanks very much. It really helps us understand the reality of risks that we're facing. But water security isn't just about pipes and dams. It's also about governance, policies, leadership, and accountability. So let's turn a little bit to the governance side of the crisis. And Benoît, I'm going to start with you. Our municipalities are in the front line of water delivery. So in your experience, what are the governance failures that are driving collapse at local level?
So firstly, we have a 25 to 35% indigent population that's registered that is unable to pay for basic services, but by law have to be and are generally speaking provided free services. So 25%, you've got to add 25 to 35% on the price of doing anything, because that has to be recovered from the others. But the fundamental issue of the funding for water or energy or waste is not ring-fenced. And so that's being addressed now by Treasury, and it is going to be forced upon on local government, because national government can't intervene, but what Treasury can do is control the purse. So, and it started doing that by threats and by actually carrying out the withholding of funding, which actually it compounds the issue, the problems, because now you withhold the equitable share, which is meant for basic services for indigent population. You withhold it because that money is being used to pay for things like labor that you don't need, councillors that you don't need, and all the likes. All these people should be volunteers, okay? And you need a very small management team. So what's happening is the ring fencing of all basic services is busy being engineered. And what it's going to do is going to make sure that if Joburg, for example, sells 18 billion rands worth of water, it gets 18 billion rands worth of revenue, which it used to do. And that money cannot be swept out of their account. That will be a criminal offense. And that's very easy to pick up. Treasury picked up the last 4 billion rand. They picked it up the same day or overnight. So that's easy to do. So fundamentally, we've got to make sure, and it's in our constitution, all our legislation, it's a user pay principle. So that will fundamentally change the governance, because it means every rand that goes into water revenue will go into maintaining and augmenting the system, as we've spoken about. The issue of bringing funding in is nobody outside of Cape Town, none of the banks are willing to fund long-term infrastructure, especially water, given the current lack of governance at council level. So what you do is you form a utility, and the utility sits outside of the council and is managed by the private sector and other government, so like water boards and the likes. That is busy being rolled out in several areas in South Africa, and the first one that is nearly ready is the Mfuleni one, where the biggest creditor has taken over the equity and the revenue. So that's Rand Water. So what will happen there is all of the revenue from the water sales will go, water and sanitation will go into the SPV as a limited company under the Companies Act. So now you have accountability, you have the cash flows ring fence, the Mfuleni municipality cannot touch anything, right? And Treasury is busy at the moment doing the finishing touches on the legislation, because there's lots of nuts and bolts in this to make this happen. What that's going to do is enable the Water Partnership Office, who has set up a blended finance platform, and its first priority is non-revenue water, but then reuse and then new water. But what it has set up is quite a clever thing of blended finance, which is a global trend the last decade of de-risking highly geared sovereigns. So most governments in the world really have too much debt, so they're less able to provide sovereign guarantees in PPP and PSP, private sector participation and public-private participation type contracts or concessions. So through the blended finance platform, you de-risk things. Now, if you've got secure cash flows into an SPV, you've got blended finance from DFIs, concessional funding, and commercial funding. What happens is you end up with a model that so financial fraternity globally have accepted this, and in South Africa too. So what will happen is the Water Partnership Office will be one of the mechanisms with the SPVs of actually starting to unlock the flow of funds to the actual work. So not through the council, through the supply chain management and all that, it will actually go through the SPVs, where the private sector will have a shareholding and a say, and so will the financial community. And this will start de-risking things. So all the skullduggery of money being used for other things, that all falls away completely. So there's a lot of pushback, especially at local government level, because now, I mean, the council said to me, but Benoît, how are we going to build our roads and do the gardens and pay our salaries because we're using water revenue? I said, you're not. But one thing's for sure, if you don't sort out your water security, you won't have a council, you won't have residents, you won't have industry, you won't need roads. So, take your pick. So national government is forcing this down people's throats. So that's to open up the funding and governance issues. Plus, it has passed two sets of legislation. One is in Parliament, has gone through Cabinet, which is the licensing of water service providers. So water service authorities have never carried out their constitutional mandate of being the governance or oversight regulator of water service providers. It's been an internal, we call it buddy-buddy system, is we as the Water Service Authority will give it to the local municipality, irrespective of whether they have capability or not. That's now gone. So what will happen is you have a license regime, and if you don't meet them, you lose your license, and somebody else has to step in. This is where the SPVs come in, etc. So that there's going to be probably 250 of them. That's going to happen over the next 3 to 5 years. So, but the only way those private sector participation water service providers will be able to take part is through the SPV and the blended finance and the Water Partnership Office. This is all supported by the World Bank, the IMF, etc., and it's broadly supported by pension funds. We've even got pension funds from Europe, from the UK, wanting to invest into our projects over here. So, but they just want the governance and the risk issues addressed. So all of this we've been working on, and we're starting to do proof of concepts to actually do that, to start unlocking it. So what will happen is, as we sort out the water issues, for Berger's comment over there, who's involved in the sanitation side, because water service provision and security and sanitation has decreased markedly the last decade, according to national government's numbers, not our metrics. And as we sort out the water side, what will happen is the sanitation side will start following through, and we'll be able to start giving people dignified sanitation, which they don't have. So that's a very, very short summary of it.
Thanks very much, Benoît. If you could implement one practical governance reform tomorrow that would have the biggest impact, what would that look like?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
So we're busy launching a proof of concept. Everybody's watching it very carefully. We just have to make sure that we don't get sabotaged and all this. And what we're going to do is bring in R500 million into a water service authority, water service provider, address the physical leaks component of the non-revenue water. They have 100% recovery rate at the moment. It is fully ring-fenced, and be able to demonstrate that within a period of 2 to 3 years, we can reduce the physical leaks from, let's say, the 30s to 45% down to between 5 and 15%, and without subsidizing one construction mafia, and with 100% of every rand going to where it needs to go, and in a blended finance model whereby there's absolutely no risk unless the town shut down, but there's no risk of default. So we're hoping for that proof of concept to be able to address the other 130, 140 collapsed water service providers over the next 18 months or so. So it's a really big task. And, one of our concerns, and we'll be busy testing, is the supply chains are going to have to gear up to supply into not the proof of concept, but into the rollout. We're talking 257 billion rand a year until 2050. So there's a huge amount of supply chains that really form part of the water and sanitation reindustrialization master plan that we worked on half a decade ago that hasn't started yet. So talking about pipes, clamps, measurement devices, IoT devices, even things like cement, steel, we just won't have enough, and we'll have to gear that up. So it's a nice problem to have. And a lot of this, the idea is not to import it. The idea is to re-stimulate the local supply chains. And most of it will require a certain amount of labor, but it will stimulate things like yellow plant, for example. So there's a lot of things, and this will be the biggest industrial program in the Southern Hemisphere by far, absolutely by far. So it's very exciting, but it's very difficult to get going. So we're not thinking of it. We're busy, we're kicking off, and we're starting. So hopefully we can broadcast Q1, Q2 next year, how we've started to get going.
Very exciting stuff indeed. Now you've touched on it just a little bit. My final question for you before I switch over to Anthony, how do we shift from a culture of crisis management to long-term maintenance and planning instead?
Yeah, I think we spoke about the PR. The narrative needs to be. It's complex narrative, so the narrative needs to change quite a lot. But really, I'm a great believer in digital water, and we're doing great things with our water credits and debit trading in the US. We're launching that also in Australia, but also in our water trading in Australia off our tokenization of water. We're the first. We started 7-8 years ago on this, and in actual fact, what we're seeing is that we're helping bridge the trust deficit between the various stakeholders. So it's not just business and society and government, by having a central point to truth, a closer collaboration between those who have the data, and getting it into data that is accepted by all parties. Like the Gauteng dashboard is not accepted by all parties, but it's a good step forward, because whose data is it? And then when people say it's government's data, trust goes. So the technology is a huge driver in being able to bring these things in, and at accelerated rate. The challenge we have, because it's not really a problem, the challenge we have is that the water sector is so slow to embrace new technology, and that's a global thing, that it takes a long time to get the traction. But once the traction starts, it really gets going. So in Australia, there's the most sophisticated water trading market. We in actual fact can't keep up with the work, with the demand. The US is medium pace because they have the biggest mitigation trading markets in the world by far, by absolutely far. And but putting it onto a digital platform is a big change management exercise. And in Europe, where we've also started with our mitigation trading and tokenization, is there it's so over-regulated. England was under-regulated, but over-regulated that the digital platforms are viewed as trying to overcome some of those difficulties. So watch the space. Digital water is the fastest growing subsector in water and sanitation, globally, and it plays a very important role. But it's relatively new. It's a decade old, at most. So there's quite a lot of learning pains. There's a certain amount of risk, etc. And also people are not willing to share a lot of their data. And there's that trust issue where is if I share my data, now is it going to be used against me and all this? So from a social engineering perspective, it's quite complex. And that's the most complex part. The software engineering is not that complex. It's complex, but not that's overcomable. So digital water is something that is embraced in the first or developed world. But in the developing world, it's like with mobile phones, it can help us catapult and catch up very quickly, once embraced. So the PR machine and the digital world are really important cogs in overcoming our issues.
Thanks very much for that, Benoît. If we can now switch over to you, Anthony. South Africa's water law is considered to be very progressive, but implementation lags. Where do you see the biggest disconnect between policy and practice for South Africa?
Good question to answer. Yes, the water law is there. It's sophisticated, regarded by the world. South Africa is also increasingly regarded as a failed state by the world. So, in other words, you've got this total disconnect between the reality, the real world, and the perceived world. So, in the real world, the South African water law is, I would almost argue, is unworkable. You cannot implement all the different bits and pieces that the national water law requires. Now, I don't want to sound pessimistic because I'm very strongly pro South African democracy. I want the South African democracy to succeed, but I don't see the water law as being a major success story, and certainly it's not going to help us to get better. If anything, it's what we're seeing is that the law is being used, for example, by the mafias. The law is being used as a lever to muscle the mafias into the construction sites, for example, the construction mafia or the water mafia. So the law is not an enabler in South Africa. The law is a disabler, or it's a weapon. And therefore, I think that is a major problem. I think South Africa has got a very big trust deficit, and I see this. I've been doing some work in Cape Town for a while now, and I see the trust deficit in Cape Town over the sewage outfall issue is massive. DA run Metro and all that kind of good stuff, but the trust deficit is very substantial. And I keep trying to tell them work on the trust deficit, and they keep saying they don't have a trust deficit. But from my perspective, there's a great trust deficit, and I think the digital water thing that Benoît was talking about. As you know, I've been on the record with you before. I'm very bullish on the whole digital value chain. I think it's the future, very much the future. I endorse it fully wherever I can, wherever I can make an impact. And part of that digital issue is it restores trust in this growing trust deficit. And this trust deficit is not only a South African thing; it is a global issue. There's a global trust deficit happening everywhere, linked back to the COVID-19 lockdowns and all all that kind of stuff, the trust in data and scientific trust, and the believing in experts and all that, climate change, all that sort of stuff. It's all about mistrust. There's a deep, profound trust deficit between the general public and, let's call it, science, engineering, and technology. They just don't trust those things, and government is in the middle there. So that is a big issue. I would like to say one or two positive things, if I can. And the positive thing I'd like to mention is I've been watching a little water concession in a place called Ilembe, in north of Durban, in South Africa, and there was a thing called Scissor Water, who started there as a sort of public-private partnership some years ago. There's been a lot of internal politics, people trying to hijack it and one thing and another, but it is endured, and I'm told that the contract is now being extended. So in other words, there's an example of a success story, public-private partnership, success story that has been enduring and lasting. And then finally, I'd just like to say one more thing, just a recent observation, because I'm now living in Australia, and I've therefore got this sort of, my feet are on two continents, and I've got a good sort of view of both. And what I'm seeing now in South Africa, government is not an enabler. Government is an impediment rather than an enabler. You have to deal with government, but government doesn't make your life any easier. Government, if anything, the bigger the problem, the bigger the money that somebody can ask you to bribe them to make the problem go away. And in Australia, it's the exact opposite. And I'd just like to give a little example that I've just recently seen. In the last couple of days, I've been traveling up the north coast of Western Australia, and went to a place called Lancelin Bay. It's a tourist place. It's sort of think of a Manzimtoti kind of, in South Africa, what a Manzimtoti is to the Gauteng people. That's what Lancelin Bay is to the people of Perth. It's a 2 hours drive away from the city, and it's a nice little tourist place. Very water constrained, and the same sort of things that we have in South Africa. However, talking about local authorities, the local authority observed that there was an individual running a little coffee trolley on the beachfront. And that coffee trolley was a little one-man business. It was a little family-run operation to bring in a bit of extra revenue for that family. And the municipality approached that person and said, "How can we help you?" Now, that's an important thing. The municipality said, "How can we help you?" And that little operator said, "You can help me because I am running a generator here because I want to keep my coffee hot, and that generator is a big part of my cash flow. And if I can get rid of the generator, then my business will become a little bit more profitable, and my life will become a little bit easier." So they, at their insistence, put in an electrical supply at that place where that coffee vendor is operating from. As a result, there's less pollution, less noisy petrol generators on the beach, more coffee being supplied, more services being supplied, but the local authority enabled a small business to thrive. And that's the important thing, the local authority as an enabler versus the local authority as an impediment. And that's what I'd like to wrap this thing up on.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. Now, you talked a little bit about the public trust deficit. In your opinion, how do we start to restore public trust in water institutions?
Look, it's an extremely difficult problem, because once trust is broken, now it's like once a marriage is in distress, once a partner has been cheating in a spousal relationship, it's very difficult to rebuild that trust. And that's what it is like. We've got to think of it like that, Trust is a fragile commodity, but without trust, we can't have a civilized conversation. So I link trust to civilization. I link trust to compassion. I link trust to integrity. I link trust to the ability to raise capital, because you can now go to a bank and say, "I'm a trustworthy person." So trust is a very, very important commodity, and you can't force someone to trust you. You've got to walk the walk, and you've got to demonstrate. I mentioned this thing in Lancashire now. That is a demonstration of public trust, because there is a local authority that realizes that they want to grow their community and they want to do something positive for the community. So they are going out of their way to try and make life easier. So public trust is about getting off your high horse. Stop believing your own propaganda, your own hubris, because there's empirical evidence to suggest that when a government falls, or when a government enters a national security crisis, very often before that happens, there is a deficit of public trust, and that is often correlates with the fact that your officials, your elected officials, and your government leaders believe their own hubris, and they will not listen to the fact that, or they will not accept the fact that the public doesn't believe that. And that is a precursor to a bad thing to come. And that bad thing to come is a total breakdown of trust in society. So I think that is the situation in South Africa. We have to actively work on rebuilding public trust. And it's a slow and painful process. It's like repairing a damaged intimate relationship with a loved one. You've got to work at that thing slowly. You've got to restore that trust. And you've got to accept that it might not ever be fully restored. But you've got to work at it, and I just don't see much effort. In fact, what I see happening is the contrary. When I talk to some of these political leaders, they just double down, because they say they know their stuff, and who am I? What must I? I'm talking tomorrow to a group of these people. And I can just anticipate what's going to happen, because I've spoken to the same people before, and they just double down. They know what's going on. We mustn't tell them what's happening in their space. So then, why do you reach out to me and ask my opinion? Then don't ask my opinion, and just carry on doing what you want to do, and meet the same end result.
No, absolutely, totally agree. So governance is a huge challenge, but there's also opportunity in South Africa, because we've got access to some of the world's smartest innovations and approaches. But the big question is, how do we move from crisis management to real solutions that are future-proof? So let's explore for a minute where innovation can fit in. And Benoît, I'm going to start with you. Digital platforms are being piloted for water trading and quality monitoring. Do you see this as a realistic solution for South Africa? And what safeguards do we need to make it work?
So science is being, as Tony says, being challenged, and engineering and I call it common sense, really, but high-grade common sense. But, once it's on a person's mobile or tablet, it tends to be credible, irrespective of the source. So, let's use that to our advantage. So, what we found is by, let's say, exchanging pollution in a catchment area, we're doing this in the States, in the eastern part, by exchanging that debit that you have earned as a delinquent, and for a credit that you as a developer or government have gone and mitigated. So very similar to carbon credits, but it's a remediation thing more than a swapping thing. What we do is we start driving the right behavior. Now, by putting that, what we call mitigation banking, by putting that onto a digital platform open to stakeholders, what we have found is that the veracity of the data tends to be a lot better, and you start inculcating trust. So in Australia, where we're involved in the water trading side, the mitigation is being developed on the water trading side now for quite a long time, is what we found is the price of water steadies. It sometimes comes down, not up, because now it's not opaque. The deals are on the table. It's not just for the regulator, the buyer and the seller, but for the stakeholders in that supply chain. And you can see now, this is the amount of water available. These are the prices trading at this time of the year for these type of volumes. So now you've got transparency, and you start inculcating trust. So what we're going to do in South Africa is, by using the backbone, which is water ledgering technology, what we're going to be doing is enabling the visibility, because there's a lot of apps that have been developed and they've all failed because it is a complex source of information. Now, the information's there. The IT devices are there in the metros, that is. The telemetry is there. The SCADA systems are there. So that's digital. But digitalization is taking it to the phone with some actionable intelligence so that where the consumer can see that because the WhatsApp channel on Joburg Water has got all that information, right? But can see in a live basis is that my system, so I'm on this reservoir, like linked to a depot, and it's now running at 40%. And if I don't reduce my water, it's going to go down to 30, and then they shut the reservoir. Or it's actually increasing, and I can actually fact and top up the pool, which is half empty. When you start seeing that visibility, where the information starts going through to the consumer and to society and to the NGOs and the likes, what happens is, firstly, you're disclosing information. The source of the information, generally speaking, is accepted because those are devices, IT devices are calibrated annually or biannually by independent bodies. So you can go and audit and see, but also when you've got smart analytics, you can see if the things are starting to relay nonsense data. So, and having that on mobile devices that everybody, we do our banking, we book our dinners or lunches on diner things. You can pay your electricity, your water, everything through, you can do virtually everything through a mobile device. So having that accessible, and all the attempts to it have actually failed on those apps. And they failed because the data comes from different parties. That's the complexity. But the Gauteng dashboard has now shown that with some effort and collaboration, we're able to get one dashboard with the bulk supplier, the council, and with the regulator and with the water service provider, all that information into one dashboard. And nobody's criticized the veracity of it. So it is there. Now, the thing is, how do you automate that? And those things are in actual fact, like that Eskom's a push thing, they're not that difficult to do in energy, but in water it's a little bit more complex, but it is achievable. So that will help us overcome the trust deficit from a society perspective, but we're using it now to actually overcome the trust deficit from a funding perspective. And that's what we are busy piloting, because what that will happen is it will make sure that the costs are offset by the revenues that are secured on a long-term basis, and the technology enables that so that it cannot be changed. So our cities are not going to disappear. The rural ones is a problem, but the big cities are not going to disappear. So it's viewed as highly fundable from that perspective. And we've looked at the London markets fund round. They're very, very bullish, and they're pushing us to accelerate. So not the other way around. So it's a governance issue, but also transparency. And I think the technology that we have available now to put through on a mobile phone or device is in actual fact extremely powerful, because that can become the narrative and overcome all the different noises and all the likes. So that's a start.
It absolutely is, yes. So my final question for you, Benoît, on the technology side is, which of the three innovations between desalination, reuse, and smart metering would you say is the most realistic for South Africa right now?
So when we talk smart metering, that's from bulk through to end user. And I think that's really important, because if you don't measure, we can't manage. And there are various types of innovations taking place in South Africa to reduce the cost of household smart meters. Not the industrial ones, but households. So we saw in day zero it was just too expensive. It was about 5,500 rand a household. That was far too much. It needs to be 1,000 or 1,500. So I think the smart metering is important, because when you know what you're using and it's visible, you're able to adapt your behavior accordingly. So in the process industry, for example, we do that very carefully, and it's very sophisticated compared to a municipal system. Very, very sophisticated. And we're able to manage those flows, and obviously the quality too. So the smart metering is an absolute priority. And this is part of the initiative that the metros are taking on, is to convert all their bulk meters to smart digital meters, and then to try and use in their district measurement areas, the DMA, so let's say at system level, to have smart meters in there, linked to the pressure reducing valves. Then you can start managing the flows, the pressures, and the likes. from a digital perspective based on what the demand is and what the supply situation is. So the smart metering is a very broad thing. It's an IoT device, and we will see it eventually that all of the households, irrespective of LSM, will have smart meters. It's absolutely important. Otherwise, we're flying blind, and mechanical meters are designed for 6 to 8 years, and most of them are 20 to 30 years old. They're not measuring correctly.
Absolutely. So, Anthony, if we can move to you now for a minute in our closing segment here. You've talked about South Africa heading towards a water reset. What does that reset look like for ordinary South African citizens, and how do we prepare for such a reset?
Yes, thank you. Okay, that's a complex question. I'm gonna answer it by linking it up to the question that you asked Benoît just before this one. You spoke about decel recovery and smart meters. All of those are necessary, and every one of them is mistrusted. Let me say it again. Each of those is necessary, but all are mistrusted. And why is it? Why are they mistrusted? Because there's a mindset there's a trust deficit that is taking place within a broader space that's, let's call it, conspiratorial or fed by conspiracy theories. And there's all these sort of myths and legends about what's going to happen to you if you recycle water and blah, 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 blah. So none of those things can ever happen unless we overcome the trust deficit. If we overcome the trust deficit, all three of those things have to happen. So sorry, just get back to the question you asked me now. Just please refocus me again.
Sure. My question to you was, what does the reset look like, and how do we prepare for it?
Okay, so I think the reset looks to me like it's going to be catastrophic. It's not going to be an easy reset. It's not going to be a soft reboot. That's my humble professional opinion, and I wish I had a different opinion, but that's my opinion. So I think systems you're going to see systemic failure, and systemic failure is going to suddenly wake people up. And that systemic failure is going to be ugly, because until such time as we reboot, we're not going to have a restoration of confidence in the economy. We're not going to have a net inflow of foreign direct investment. We're not going to have all the things that need to happen for us to come out the other side. So that reset, I'm afraid, is going to be an ugly thing. I've worked with various corporations over time in a consulting capacity. I've tried to give them all the message that they must prepare for their reset. I would argue that 80% of them have ignored the message, and they just say it's another one of many crises they're going to deal with it when it hits them. So I don't think that the let's call it the major corporate sector, I don't think that they are particularly organized when it comes to this. Households are becoming more organized. They're going off grid. They've got their little JoJo tanks. They're doing, those that can afford it have already done it. Those that can't afford it, well, they're going to have to start thinking about how to do it in the near future. But I cannot see anything short of a fairly catastrophic failure that's going to wake people up to the fact that it's not a looming crisis. We are deep in the crisis. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, it absolutely does. I want to thank both of you immensely for such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. But before we say goodbye to our audience, I'd like to ask each of you for a final word, and I'll start with you, Benoît. If you had one message to leave South Africans with today about our water future, what would that be?
So it's only by collaborating together that we can, let's say, pinch the current collapse that we see. Europe was destroyed after the Second World War, as was Japan, and it managed to rebuild. So I think we can also do that. So we need to collaborate. We need to depoliticize these basic services. We're one of the only countries in the world that's politicized water. So I believe we can get out of it I've seen some within government. I've seen some 180-degree turnaround in attitude and in arrogance, which means that they see the cliff. So, from that perspective, I think we're well equipped technically, commercially, to get to this. I see active citizenry has exponentially activated itself, which it's really, really big. There's even the political party that was formed now to address the issues in the municipal elections, these specific issues, etc. So the awareness has increased to an extent where, yes, the big corporates are still lazy, but I think they're in for quite a shock, especially those in Sandton at the moment without water. They are complaining. So when you go there, you see it. So I think I don't know if we're at a turning point, but we've got the tools, and I think we've got the awareness to start embarking on this reboot we talk about.
Thanks very much, Benoît. And Anthony, if we can ask you for a closing comment, if you had to leave a message for South Africans about our water future, what would your message look like?
Yes, I'm inherently an optimistic person, and I would like to leave an optimistic message. I find it increasingly difficult to be optimistic about these things, so I'm going to try my very best. And my best is to say that we need to depoliticize water. Unless we depoliticize water, we are not going to come out of this thing in one piece. And the way we depoliticize water is critically important. So how are we going to do that? Firstly, we've got to realize that government is not the source of the solution. They are the cause of the problem. We've got to understand that. And I'm not being facetious when I say that, but everyone thinks, oh, what is government going to do about this? Government has got us to where we are today. So now to expect government to turn it around it's just not going to happen, okay? So we've got to think about how to do that ourselves. And I happen to be party to a number of initiatives in South Africa. Some of them are private groupings, private chat rooms or whatever. They're all talking about the need for change in South Africa. So I can say, I agree with Benoît. There's an exponential growth in interest about the need to change. There's also, from what I can see, sitting in multiple groups, they're all very frustrated. None of them know how to change. And they're all defaulting back to the situation that ultimately this is a constitutionally driven crisis. We can only effect change through the ballot box, through the constitution, unless you want to go a revolutionary route, in which case you overthrow the constitution, you kick it out, and now you've got to be prepared to take on the might of the state as a revolutionary. So that's kind of the impasse we're in. I don't want to be in that space. I've always been one that errs on the side of law and order. Therefore, I believe we need to support our water boards. We need to reach out to them. We need to tell them when they're doing something wrong, but we also need to be supportive when they're doing something right. Water boards are critically important. We need to think more about the Caesar waters of the world that I told you about earlier on, and the PPP that Benoît was talking about. We need to support those because those are parts of the future. But then we get into the problem once we start talking about the PPP thing, there's this group of this active citizenry that is conspiracy theory kind of oriented and whatever. They say, desalination's bad for you, and recycled sewage is even worse for you, and smart meters is government trying to control you. So in other words, they are the problem. That mindset is the problem, and that mindset is the product of this trust deficit. So we keep getting back to the trust deficit thing. We've got to sort that thing out. So I hope I'm as optimistic as I can be, within the constraints of the very dubious world we currently live in. But I personally believe that South Africa is heading in the very near future for catastrophic failure, particularly Gauteng in particular. I believe that they are seriously heading for a blood nose that they've never seen before.
Anthony and Benoît, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights with us today. And I hope that the viewers have a clearer understanding of how water security, governance, and innovation intersect in South Africa. You were watching the Water Hour Live. Thank you for joining our show. And if you missed the live, thank you for watching the replay. Until next time, it's goodbye for now. Thank you for joining us on The Water Hour, the show that dives deep into the critical role of water in shaping our society and economy. Join us next time as we explore the work of the South African Water Chamber, only on The Water Hour.